I think that the arts give us a unique window to aspects of ourselves, to our internal workings, to our affective states, our emotional states, our internal visceral states that we often don't have the time, space, or opportunity to reflect on. And so I think that the arts enable us to connect to parts of ourselves that are really important and often neglected.
Welcome to the Future of Psychiatry podcast, where we explore novel technology and new innovations in mental health. I'm your host, Dr. Bassi, an addiction physician and biomedical engineer. Today, we're with Dr. Robert Bilder. He's a clinical neuropsychologist and has been actively engaged in over 20 years in research on the neuroanatomic and neurophysiological basis of mental illnesses. He has received many awards for his research contributions, served on diverse federal and international advisory boards, provided editorial service to many scholarly journals, and received multiple grants from the NIH, private foundations, and industry. His work has been presented in more than 100 publications and 300 scientific presentations. He's the director of the Tenenbaum Center for the Biology of Creativity and holds the Tenenbaum Family Chair in Creativity Research position. Well, welcome, Dr. Bilder.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
The bass and the guitar in the background definitely set the scene, set the stage for you and who you are. But I'd like to get to know you and how you got interested in the meshing of creativity with the treatment of mental illness.
My involvement in creativity research was really somewhat serendipitous. The director of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, Peter Wybrow, got together with a philanthropist, Michael Tenenbaum, and they decided they wanted to do something fun and interesting and decided it would be great to put out a call for research on the neuroscience of creativity. We were well known at the Semel Institute for doing neuroscientific studies of various other kinds of brain functions, including mental illnesses, but there had really not been a focus on creativity in the brain. I put in a proposal to study certain brain features associated with creativity, and then over time became more and more interested in that and was fortunate enough to receive an endowed chair from the Tenenbaum family in order to facilitate my study of creativity in the brain. So it's been a lot of fun and very lucky for me to be able to do so.
When an individual experiences mental illness, be it depression, anxiety, is it safe to say their level of creativity diminishes? Is it that simple, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, it's slightly more nuanced than that, but there's what I would say qualifies as a myth that creativity and madness go together. Exciting though that concept is, and it's easy to bring to mind examples of people who were exceptionally, extraordinarily creative and also happen to have mental illnesses. It looks like the nature of that association has been often exaggerated, and basically it's not good to have a mental illness. When people do experience what we now define as mental illnesses, then typically their creativity will be impacted adversely. They will not be more creative. However, there are some really interesting findings that suggest that there probably is some kind of a genetic link between the vulnerability to certain kinds of mental illness and creativity. It looks like the people who are what we call the first degree relatives, people who are just one remove from people with diagnoses of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, tend to have more creativity. So it looks like indeed there probably are shared genes that both give you an increased vulnerability to have mental illness and enable you to be more creative. But in some people, there are protective factors as well. In fact, probably in most people, that keep them from going over the edge into suffering mental illness. And for those people, they probably are more creative. But for those who do go over the edge, then they suffer decreases in creativity and mental illness. I use this term over the edge, and I hope I'm not being too glib in using that. The reason I referred to that concept is because we had a paper some years back where we described creativity as being on the edge of chaos. And there, the core idea is that our thinking and our brain activation states all exist in a range of different patterns of organization, some of which are very stable and some of which are less stable but more flexible. So you can see there are pros and cons. On the one hand, stability is seen as a good thing, but rigidity is not seen as a good thing. So if you're too stable, then the consequences will be rigidity. On the other hand, flexibility is considered a good thing, but chaos would be the extreme of flexibility and complete unpredictability that may not be advantageous. So some great thinkers, including Stuart Kaufman, who studied complexity theory, talked about the ordered regime and the chaotic regime. And then in between those two is a boundary that he called the edge of chaos. It can be argued, I think, successfully that many aspects of creativity and other processes like evolution can be explained by seeing how there's a motion from the ordered regime into the chaotic regime and towards it, but not over the edge. At the edge of chaos, near that boundary, That's where novel things occur, but things that are also connected closely enough to the stable regime that they can be useful and productive.
So it sounds like most things in our field exists on a spectrum, and we're trying to weigh the risk benefit, pros and cons of being too far towards one end of the spectrum and see how we can get to the middle in a way to utilize that to our advantage, that process or that metric. In diagnosing and treating mental illness, do you think there's some room there to have creativity weigh in as kind of a measurement to helping us understand maybe severity or maybe give insight into the treatment plan for that individual? Or is it too variable among individuals based on their set point or interest in creative works and whatnot?
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, and I'm not sure it's been as fully explored as it might be. I think that there are a number of things you said that are really important. One of them is that having to do with dimensional versus categorical approaches to mental illness altogether. And I'm a big fan of dimensional approaches and a harsh critic of categorical approaches. And not that the categorical approaches may not be useful at times and in certain settings, but I think that it's rare that they're actually useful. And I think categorical approaches have held back the science by giving us false categories that actually impair our ability to find the biological bases of these things. And also it gives people the false impression that they may exist on one side of the boundary or other and conceptualize themselves as being mentally ill or mentally well for that matter. And I think that those classifications are false and do us a disservice. So the idea that we all exist on continua and we all have strengths and weaknesses along those continua, I think is definitely the reality and not just a scientific concept. So almost everyone exists on a continuum from, sadness through happiness. And the people in the lowest 10% or so of, low positive emotion tend to be called depressed and to cross that threshold for having their functioning be impaired. But the implication of this is really profound because if we could move everybody up using, for example, positive psychology interventions or perhaps creativity boosting interventions, all we would need to do would be to have people feel just noticeably better, like a half of a standard deviation for the science and statistical nerds out there. That subtle movement that's just noticeable clinically would be enough to get rid of 2/3 of all incident depression. And it would make the rest of the people who weren't at risk of being depressed much happier. The same thing is true for anxiety disorders. It's a little bit more complicated with substance use disorders, but since they are probably also very much linked to anxiety and depressive disorders, I think that the same story also holds.
Makes sense. When I conceptualize mental illness, I think of, and very much kind of in a CBT framework and many other schools of thought within psychiatry, think of it this way, but we recognize that we get caught up in our own thought rehearsals, like repeated thoughts that really are maladaptive and not helpful. And we can't seem to break out of those ruminating thoughts in some way. And we think that such truth about our own thoughts because they're coming from us. And for me, I see a clear link here to using flexibility tactics, strategies that would boost the individual's level of flexibility to think outside the box and problem solve. And I think there's even a type of therapy called problem solving therapy and to help work with this. And I can see how one is linked to the other, why the creative works would be so important to treating mental illness. But I would love to hear your thoughts as to why it's important.
Yeah, there are a number of really fascinating points that I think are directly related to what you're describing. And one thing that listeners may not be familiar with is the whole theory that involves the broadening and narrowing of attentional control. And I think that it's gotten probably the best done research in the contemplative sciences, as they're now called, but basically from folks studying meditation practices and trying to understand those. There are two kinds of meditation that have been identified since ancient Tibetan times, one of which is called focused meditation, which involves the narrowing of attention to a particular element like a mantra or a mandala or something like, or one's own breath to try to keep attention focused on that and not to attend to other things. And then there's discursive meditation practice, which is also the broadening of attention. Now, interestingly enough, there's a great scientist at UCLA whose name is Lapsang Rapke, who's a good friend as well. I've known for a number of years. And he pointed out to me that while most of our Western meditation practices focus on broadening of attention, when he learned in Tibet, before he was the Ayurvedic physician to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he said they had to learn first focused attention. And only after they mastered that, and sometimes they never mastered that and they quit. If they could master the focal attention, then they would learn broadening of attention. It was only after they'd mastered focal attention that they were permitted to go on to do broadening of attention. But here's the key thing. They did them at the same time. So they would maintain focused attention while broadening attention. And I think that this reflects exactly the process that I was trying to refer to before about the balancing of stability and flexibility to be there near the edge of chaos. I think, as you pointed out, and I think it's quite true, many times we get sort of trapped into an overly stable regime where we may be rehearsing or stuck in our thought patterns, stuck in maladaptive thought patterns, and find it difficult to break out of those. We may be trapped into loops that are dominated by certain reward seeking or pain avoiding stimulation. And so we may have patterns that have been adaptive, and we should, treat ourselves well, given that, all of us are just trying to get by. But sometimes we learn habits and get stuck in habits that are not good for us. So many times people can benefit from introducing flexibility and moving themselves up in that direction towards the more flexible. And I think that's where the broadening of attention exercises and other creativity promoting exercises can be quite helpful. It's also worth noting that separately from the meditation stuff, there have been many studies of attentional control that show that if you get people to broaden their attention, they become less anxious just by increasing their attention to peripheral cues and have a broader sensitivity to the outside world. The rationale for this appears to come from evolution, where in the presence of threat, our attention becomes narrowed to what is probably the threatening thing in the environment. And we have to figure out whether we're going to flee or fight. And those decisions have to be made rapidly, and it requires that one pay very close attention. However, with more subtle stimulation, our attention may actually broaden. We become more sensitive to all the things in the environment. There are a variety of ways to develop practices that can broaden attention, and those appear to be effective anxiolytics, and engagement in creative pursuits may similarly promote that kind of increased cognitive flexibility.
I recently stumbled upon something that could very well change your clinical workflow. I always thought having a medical scribe was only for busy ER doctors. Well, with the release of all the new AI tech, a company called Lindy developed an AI-based note writing scribe app, and it works phenomenally well. You start your patient visit, press record, and it listens and transcribes and then outputs your note exactly how you want it. What I like the most about it is that you can customize exactly how you want your note to come out. And that's different from some of the other AI-based note writing apps out there. For example, if you want 5 sentences in your intro and you want to include quotes, psychotherapy themes discussed, it will do exactly that. Or if you simply want to dictate and use short phrases in your dictation, you can do that too. It can also give you follow-up instructions, referral letters, and consultation notes. Absolutely amazing. You can even use it for other AI-based tasks. It will save you so much time and make you more engaged with your patient's visit. Sign up now at lindy.ai/Bruce for a 7-day free trial with absolutely nothing to lose. And Lindy is giving listeners of this podcast 50% off their first month. That's lindy.ai/Bruce for 50% off your first month. Please go and check it out. I can guarantee you that you will be amazed at what you see. Now back to the episode.
One tactic or strategy that I've heard of to essentially broaden attention would be to sit somewhere. Doesn't have to be anywhere in particular. It could be a forest or nature, and try to list 5 things from each sense that you're taking in. And there's the obvious ones that you start off with, and then you're like, oh yeah, there actually is a sound that I didn't even pay attention to, that I was just glossing over, of some animal or some bird, or the leaves moving across other leaves, like things that are just going on in our background that our default mode just like kind of X's out. That was a cool exercise for me, because our brain is really good at not focusing on things it doesn't really think are important. Is that one of those strategies, or can you expand upon a few more for us?
That sounds like a lovely approach. And I think that our sensory world is so full of information that we are seldom focused upon. Usually we narrow our attention to focus on just one particular thing, but by broadening one's attention, it is possible to pick up so many different elements. I guess one thing that may be worth noting is that some of the contemplative practices share the idea that when one's attention is drawn to a particular external stimulus, that one should develop the technique to not label it or categorize it, but to just let it pass, or to quickly categorize it. Say, oh yes, that was a sound. Usually what we find when we let our mind relax is that our attention comes back to worries or troubles. And it's particularly important that we acknowledge those as, that's just a thought that I had. It will pass. So I think that's really important. Another key thing You're talking about the kind of practices that people can get into. One thing I think is really valuable, if you can find the way to do it, is to get into a place where you really can broaden your attention and where you can see like a complete horizon. Many of us are trapped in environments that don't permit a lot of broadening of attention. I mean, we spend half of our lives now focused on humans that are, 2 inches in little boxes on screens. So this is probably increasing anxiety. In fact, I had given some talks where I talked about ZAD, Z-A-D, Zoom associated delirium, a unique mental condition. People who are spending 5 hours or more on video conferences, I think, develop a attentional narrowing that's counterproductive. And it's important to get out into the world. That's one thing about broadening of attention. Another interesting thing, when people looked at the impact of the real world or the built environment on our psychological well-being, you probably have heard of the effects of green space, and that one marker of well-being is being close to a green thing, a living thing like a plant, not just a green screen, or running water, these kinds of natural phenomena. When people have studied the psychological processes, one fascinating thing, or at least fascinating to me, is that some say that may be mediated by the sense of being away. And so the idea that it's not necessarily just being near something green or a living thing or near water or ocean, or it's making certain kinds of noises, but rather it transports us to some place that is different from where we are right now. It engenders a kind of mind traveling. And, that kind of flexibility may be particularly valuable. If we can give people the sense of being away, that may be one of the critical ingredients in promoting well-being. And I think it does just what you were suggesting, take us away from the sort of mental traps that we tend to get stuck in, or the mental treadmills or hamster wheels of our minds.
So many good analogies. How do you get somebody to feel that they're away? I know for me, when I feel stuck in a particular trap of difficulty, whether it's school or family issues or health issues, you feel like you really can't get out of that space and your whole kind of world is collapsing in on you.
Yeah. Yeah. So in order to promote that kind of, being away, it's not always easy. First, one has to have the motivation to be able to remove oneself from particular environments that may be counterproductive, especially in substance use and addiction. There is well studied triggering like cues that may keep us stuck in those mental loops. So if one can muster the energy to pull oneself out of that and actually physically remove oneself, for example, out to a point of nature and make a decision to go and be away, that is, one helpful thing to do. I've got buddies who work in the tech industry who are creating virtual reality environments that I think that we all hope will be successful in helping people to be transported. People vary in how comfortable they are in those environments. I think there's enormous promise there. And so that's an area to, keep watch over. And I think that the most valuable or to build and the most widely accessible are mental practices that include positive psychology practices like meditation practices, but then also to be in good psychotherapies where one can develop the skills and habits to break out of the ruts and enable that openness to being away and work on the underlying mental processes that keep us from experiencing being away regularly. You may have heard of the author, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I like to say it because I feel like I can pronounce his name very well.
You must have practiced that.
Someone gave me a hint. A good colleague, John Monteroso, said, "Oh, you just have to remember cheeks sent me high." And if you start with cheeks sent me high, and then I tried to add a slight Eastern European flourish to that, I think it sounded good. And he said it was not bad. Rest his soul. He passed away recently, but he's, was an amazing guy. And he wrote he was, I think, the first person to really define flow, the flow state, and wrote a beautiful book on creativity and several other works on creativity. He had a couple of tips for how to be more creative. And I think it links also to getting yourself the sense of being away and increasing flexibility. He said, every day you should try to surprise someone and you should try to surprise yourself. The latter is very hard. It's usually pretty easy to come up with a practice that, you say, well, I got to surprise somebody. But surprising yourself is not easy because it's sort of like tickling yourself because you're always monitoring what you're doing and what you intended to do. That's why it's hard to tickle yourself. In the same way, it's hard to surprise yourself. But I think you can do it if you explicitly focus on doing things a little differently. You don't have to be turning the world upside down. But even if you're, heading to work, well, can you take 3 minutes to take a different route, go on a different street, walk a different way, try something new?
Yeah, there was a lesson in the Waking Up app, which I love, Sam Harris's app. And one of the lessons was about how rarely we do anything that's not prepared already. Like going out to eat, we look at the reviews. Going to a place, we look at the Google Maps to figure out where we're going to go. We Google search constantly everything. We're never really going out and like exploring anything without any preconceptions related to it. That's exactly what you're describing. We're looking at a screen, we're looking at a map, and we're just kind of like robots following along with what technology is telling us to do.
Yeah. And, we're so habit driven. I mean, audience members may occasionally get prompts from their phone or their car saying, "Oh, are you heading home?" In fact, I remember I was at a talk once and there was a guy who had invented some of the AI that was going along with the General Motors OnStar systems. And he was trying it out. And the car said to him one Thursday afternoon, said, "Hey, John, it looks like you're heading home. Should I put in another order for the pepperoni pizzas at Vinny's tonight?" He just found it so intrusive and annoying that he turned the thing off and killed part of the program. But I think that, we are so driven by habit. Our physical location can usually be predicted. I've heard estimates as high as 90% of the time. Where we are can be predicted within a few feet just by monitoring our physical location for about a week. We're so set in our ways. So I like to think I'm a wild and crazy guy, but the reality is I'm always doing exactly the same thing in the exact place almost all the time. So breaking out of those habits is really interesting. And that's why in our Tenenbaum Center for the Study of Creativity, we focused on a number of underlying cognitive traits that we thought were really important for creativity. One of them is inhibition and response inhibition. And while many people think, oh, yes, well, you must be uninhibited or disinhibited in order to be creative. That's true in part. But what we focused on is you have to be able to inhibit your habits. So in any particular situation, like let's say, let me ask you, tell me the names of 5 different animals as fast as you can.
Squirrel, dog. Oh, the names of the actual pets?
No, not the names. It's
All right. Squirrel, dog, horse, cow, rabbit.
all right, that's good enough. Now, those are probably not the most unusual animals. If I asked you to give me the names of exotic animals or unusual animals, it may take a little bit longer, but yeah, give me some unusual animals.
I mean, I don't know if a zebra is quite unusual enough. A dromedary, I think, is one that's on the MoCA. Can't think of any rare species. I mean, pandas are rare for the US. I was just reading an article on that, how we don't own any pandas here. That's exotic.
Right. Well, yeah, you get the sense though, that it takes a little longer to come up with those, right? And you have to actually inhibit other kinds of selections. And then you can see you were even, thinking, oh, well, should it be a rare animal or just the name be a rare name for an animal? When I did this test without specifying you should look for unusual animals, we were studying the drummer Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer for the Police. So Stuart, the first word to come out of his mouth is lemur. So really? That's the first animal that comes, most people is cat, dog, or lions, tigers, bears, the Wizard of Oz effect. These are the things that are queued up in our brain. So to get to the higher hanging fruit in the cognitive tree, you have to inhibit the low hanging stuff and not say the first thing that comes to mind or not do the first thing that comes to mind. Really putting a pause and thinking, oh, what do I really want to do? Inhibiting the initial action or prepotent response is the technical term of art, and doing something different. That's what's probably one of the keys to creativity.
It's really interesting. Appreciate that strategy. I'll be thinking about that for the rest of the day and asking a lot of people about that.
People often wonder, oh, should you germinate on ideas, incubate ideas over time, or just do it? And there's a pretty clear answer in creativity research. If you want to be generating creative products, just generate products, get them out. And there are a number of reasons why that's probably, and it's not just a probabilistic thing, like people doing more by chance are going to be producing more creative stuff. It turns out that the more you put stuff out there in the world, the more creative it tends to be. It probably is in part because it frees your mind once you put something out in the world to then entertain new ways of doing it. I was once giving a talk about creativity and there was a great art professor there. And she says, oh, this is such a relief because now it explains why my students hated me when they were taking my class. But then 3 years later, they loved me. I said, what do you mean? She says, well, I used to make them do 20 versions of every assignment. So they hated doing that, but it was really only by the 10th, 11th, and 12th versions that they were really breaking new ground and getting out all the stuff that was the first things that came to mind. And another thing is that when something is in our mind, it's occupying energy and space and is perfect. Like the art project that I have not completed, it's perfect. I actually made a sculpture that's like Michelangelo's David. It's absolutely perfect, but I haven't done it, right? So in my mind, it's perfect. Once I start chipping away at marble, it's going to be a mess. Maybe if I did it 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times, then maybe I would begin to get better at it. But once we externalize things, then we can use our powers of perception to see their strengths, see their weaknesses, and unburden our mind to think about other possibilities, other ways to do things. So just getting it out there is probably a good idea. Picasso is said to have made 50,000 artworks. That's a lot of art.
Well, I do find it interesting to bring it back to the technology piece. And I don't know if other people could relate to this, but when I see a viral video on social media and I click that profile, they probably have sometimes like 300 other videos that didn't take off. But that one gem, it took off, and there was something about it that timing was just right. And imagine if they just gave up after the 240th one. We never would have gotten that one gem. Or other individuals and musicians and artists who make it big, like in their 40s or 50s, after they've been working on something for 20 years. I mean, it just goes to show that what you're saying is totally true. Just need to keep generating and producing and enjoy the process of it, not necessarily what the outcome is, and just see what happens.
I like that a lot. Another fun read is Jaron Lanier. One of my favorite books of his is called You Are Not a Gadget. He also wrote a great book, which is, I think, titled something like 10 Reasons to Delete All Your Social Media Accounts Now. He calls it the race to be the most meta. If we look at what goes on the web nowadays, everyone is striving to abstract things to a point where he says it loses its meaning. And then people are putting stuff online that is just a direct rehashing of their immediate experience by taking a video or a selfie of something that's happening right now. I mean, Instagram is sort of built on entirely this model, or TikTok. Not all, but much. So what he suggests is don't fall for the social media platforms. Make your own website. Put on there what you want. Don't let yourself be dictated to in terms of how you present yourself by the formats of Facebook or an Instagram or a TikTok universe. It's always valuable to make sure you don't post anonymously. Always identify yourself. So, that's really your authentic self. Try posting things that take you 100 times longer to create than they do to watch. It's an interesting yardstick when we think about much of what we see on the internets is basically takes as long to watch as it took to make.
This episode is brought to you by Charm Health. If you're in the market for a secure, stable, easy-to-use EHR system, this is the place for you. I've been using Charm for over 5 years, and I've found it to be the one EHR system that I've used where I'm spending more time thinking about my patients and less time thinking about charting. It just makes everything so easy. It has everything in one spot, and their pricing is extremely transparent, unlike many other EHR systems. Every feature that you want in an EHR, Charm has, from dot phrases to e-prescribing to document management, scheduling, and billing all in one. I've studied EHR usability and also did a podcast episode on EHRs, and I can safely say that Charm is among the top in clinician satisfaction. Not to mention, they are always releasing new features, and not just to stay abreast on the current market, but user-requested features as well. They are extremely open to feedback and improving, and I've gotten to know many of them at the Charm-A-Lot conference, which was a blast. I highly recommend Charm, and I think they have a phenomenal EHR system. Reach out to me or to someone on the sales team to schedule a demo, or visit charmhealth.com for more details.
Yeah, I do feel sometimes we're on an episode of Black Mirror where we originally kind of embraced technology so much for its potential, and then it did turn into an addiction for a lot of folks. And then the technology is exclaiming that it's also the solution to the problem. It's giving you the alert that you used it too much. There's new tech to put restrictions on how often you're using it. There's new tech to monetize or gamify your addiction. It's just really extraordinary how we've kind of come full circle now to push it away or find happy limits to something like that.
Yeah, what Jaron Lanier also says is that the world is now dominated by people trying to capture our attention using the most devious ways possible, trying to monetize our attention, get eyeballs on what it is that they want to sell us. He links that also to some of the polarization that we're seeing today, politically and in other formats, and where people's attention is drawn to, pardon my language, what he calls the biggest a-holes, get the most attention and the most eyeballs, so that it draws people to become more and more a-holic in order to get attention. And so he sees that as part of what's dividing people and keeping people from being able to see each other's perspectives. And in contrast, there's the project by David Brooks that's called the WAVE Project, which basically is trying to overcome the polarization that we see and get people to actually listen to each other's perspectives and not pull to those extremes. So that's another aspect of we could call creativity is really being open to experiencing what is the other person's perspective. What are they feeling right now? What's the way they look at it?
I mean, as a psychiatrist, that's why I went into this field, but I know not many people feel the same way.
That's right. It's not easy to just listen. It's only in the last year that I learned the acronym, which I'm doing badly at today, by the way. But there's somebody, I was at a conference with a bunch of people on meditation and well-being, and somebody said the acronym WAIT, WAIT. Why am I talking?
Well, as a guest on a podcast, you have every right to talk as much as you feel like. So tell me a little bit about the Center for Biology of Creativity. What's on the forefront of innovation there? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, well, we're continuing to analyze data. We got a rich data trove from a study that we called the Big C Project, where we study people who are exceptionally creative artists, visual artists, exceptionally creative scientists, and then a group of what we call smart controls, a smart comparison group of people who were matched to the scientists and artists on intellectual ability and education in order to address the concerns that people have. Oh, well, maybe you're just studying a bunch of smart people compared to regular free range humans. So anyhow, we had these three different groups, and then we did a lot of different assessments of their brains, their behavior, did interviews. So we're continuing to plow through that data. Some of the, I think, really fascinating findings to make were having to do with the patterns of brain activity, which I think goes along with the concepts we've been talking about. But one of them was that I really like is when we look at the patterns of brain network connectivity, functional brain network connectivity, you can do certain kinds of fancy analyses using graph theory that figure out whether the network is more efficient or more random or somewhere in between. And, efficient networks are like the maps you see when you are on an airplane of the network of where the flights go for American, United, or Delta. There's hubs like in Atlanta or LA or Chicago, and then spreading out from them, you've got smaller airports, and sometimes regional carriers going off from those. That's efficient because, most of the time, you're not going to fill a lot of airplanes flying, let's say, from Burbank to Duluth, so it turns out that the big C creative brains had more of these random flights. There were more random patterns of connectivity on a global scale so that they were able to fly from Burbank to Duluth on a direct flight or a private plane, whereas the less creative folks tended to go via a big hub and then to another big hub and then out to the local airport.
Is there any data to suggest individuals with ADHD are more creative? Because I feel like they cross-pollinate and take in new ideas, even in a conversation that I have with them. And it's just so fascinating to kind of hear. It feels like an unpruned kind of childlike imagination where they're just popping in new thoughts here and there. It reminds me of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I have not seen anything on the link between ADHD and creativity per se. However, as you well know, there's what they often call comorbidity, a term that I hate in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders because we force the disorders to be separate for no good reason. And one of the criteria, if everybody wants to look up the DSM-5, I know Dr. Bassi already knows the DSM-5 cold, but for people who don't, one of the criteria for every mental disorder is not better explained by another mental disorder. So it's silly, that basically the symptoms of ADHD and bipolar disorder, there's quite a bit of overlap in some of the attentional and some of the affective traits that are shared across those syndromes. And overall, the traits of affective instability can be related to those same attentional disturbances. So to the extent that those things are true, there has been quite a bit of literature linking bipolar disorder to creativity, particularly hypomanic or, the milder forms of bipolar disorder, bipolar mania. The depressive states, less so. Nancy Andreasen, another great author and good friend, has some interesting work looking at in the Iowa Writers Project, where she believes that some mood disorder, including depressive disorders, are linked to creativity. I think that this is a unique feature of a sampling scheme that she had for her project. And in general, it's not true. There's also findings that people with certain kind of brain lesions may show certain forms of creativity. Again, while there may be, for example, frontotemporal dementias, there may be spurts of creativity following the development of certain kinds of dementia, probably through release of other functions that had previously been inhibited by intact brain territory. It's basically not a good idea to get brain damage. Stick with the brain you've got to be more creative. That's the best advice I got. Don't try to damage your brain. Don't try to get a mental illness. Those are not the paths to being creative.
Yeah, I mean, we conceptualize ADHD as a disorder and by definition, a bad thing. We want to fix it and get rid of it. It's negative. But I can see a world in which certain traits of the ADHD, kind of like what you were describing earlier about diffuse attention can be beneficial to some people in some way. Our society, in a way, we value and reward individuals who are experts in one thing. And so I think that's why we see ADHD as always a bad thing, but because, you would want somebody who's an expert in this one focused area rather than the person who has been hopping around from job to job and career path to career path. But they are also more creative and interesting, and maybe they're good at certain occupations that require them to be highly attuned to many sensory inputs to cross-pollinate new ideas from other industries to try to fix a problem. And I feel like with your pursuits and creativity, we could almost reframe those characteristics of those individuals with quote unquote ADHD as, in certain environments, yeah, maybe those ADHD symptoms are not helpful for you to take a sit-down test, but your life is not just sit-down tests. It's many things, and it's not always a bad thing to be able to have diffuse attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in all these situations, the key thing is for people to appreciate the way that their mind and their brains work, and to have a good spirit of self-acceptance and work with what you got. I mean, it's interesting. Stimulants used to treat ADHD, one theory is that they increase the frequency of responding in a reduced number of behavioral categories, basically by they narrow attention. To the extent that that's true, you would say, oh, that could be depriving people with ADHD of creativity. At the same time, creativity requires not only being flexible in one's thinking, but in identifying the components of thought and the potential actions that are going to be valuable and useful. So one has to be able to stabilize the thoughts long enough to do something good with them. So again, there's always a balance. I'm going to write a book that's called The Other Thing. And the reason why is because there's always, you go to the self-help section of the bookstore or online, you'll find 1 million books on the one thing you need to do. Healthier, happier, thinner, whatever. But there's always balance in any of these processes. I figured, we should really, every time you focus on one thing, what's the other thing that is in balance with this? And how do I keep myself centered? Coming soon, The Other Thing. Mark my words. I've been saying I'm going to write this book for a decade now, but I haven't gotten around to it.
In your mind, it's already written perfectly, though.
So far, it's perfect. Oh, you asked about the Center for the Biology of Creativity. One of the projects that we're working on now that's active is a National Endowment for the Arts Research Lab. And that is supported primarily to develop arts impact measurement tools. And so we've started with the idea that the impact of arts on health are mediated by the impact on psychological well-being. And so we try to understand, how do we assess psychological well-being, and how will we know if an arts exposure actually helped that? And so we've developed an arts impact measurement system and have several hundred questionnaires, 4,000 items that enable arts organizations to have a common framework for assessing the impact of arts on well-being. So we think that may be an important way to begin to learn more about arts experiences. And we're hoping to launch soon a website that will ask people about their peak experiences with the arts. So if you had your favorite rock concert that you ever attended and wanted to write about that, it would give you an opportunity to describe your experience. And we have the methodology by virtue of a colleague, Ariana Anderson, to analyze speech. So we'll get speech samples and analyze not only the words that are used, but the tone of voice and the way the voice was used to express that, and analyze those components in order to understand better how people are feeling at the times of these peak experiences with the arts.
Interesting. And what would be done with that data? Publish it to help support funding for the arts, or give them feedback about what their experience is?
Those things, and to try to understand better, how does the brain actually take art and art experiences and convert that into enhanced senses of well-being, productivity, personal creativity, social connectedness. All of these features we think are important outcomes of engagement with the arts. But so far, we know very little about the brain mechanisms that are responsible for those. So if we can understand the brain mechanisms, then hopefully that will, first of all, be a sales pitch for the arts, showing why they're good, helping to convince congressmen who may be reticent to support the arts, for example, but also to help us as we develop new arts and new experiences for people, help to develop those that are the most impactful and that will enable people to get the most out of them.
What would you say to an individual who doesn't feel particularly creative or interested in the arts? Why would that be important to them as a member of society?
Well, I hate to be in a position of trying to convince somebody, but I think that the arts give us a unique window to aspects of ourselves, to our internal workings, to our affective states, our emotional states, our internal visceral states that we often don't have the time, space, or opportunity to reflect on. And so I think that the arts enable us to connect to parts of ourselves that are really important and often neglected.
It's really well put. Dr. Bilder, it was really fun and interesting experience talking to you. And I really appreciate the time you took in helping describe the importance of creative work and research done in those fields for the treatment and continued progression of treating mental illness.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you for the good work you're doing and bringing valuable information to the public.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Onwards.
That's it for this episode. I'd appreciate it if you please like and share this podcast with your colleagues. It'd be especially helpful for us. If you'd like, please leave us a rating on your favorite podcatcher. If you're a clinician, I developed a course on how to start a private practice. And for patients, I've also developed a course on acceptance and commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral-based therapy lessons for treating and helping anxiety. You can find all these on our website as well as the show notes and resources for each episode. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.